China's top diplomat wraps up his four-country tour of Africa in what has become a decades-long New Year tradition for the second biggest economy in the world. What does this mean for China-Africa relations, the present and the future? Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar in for Naidu, and this is The Heat. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi made stops in Namibia, the Republic of the Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. His first overseas trip of the new year, highlighting China's engagement and influence in Africa, while strengthening China-Africa cooperation in a number of areas. We begin our coverage with CGTN's Robert Nagila in Namibia.
As China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi flew into Windhoek to begin his week-long Africa tour, the main item on the agenda was the implementation of the outcomes of the FOCAC summit and the strengthening of China-Africa relations. Wang Yi held talks with outgoing President Nangola Mbumba and President-elect Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah before flying out to the Republic of Congo, where he met with President Denis Nguesso and his foreign minister. Both sides had reason for optimism.
In accordance with the consensus reached between President Xi Jinping and President Denis Sassou Nguesso, we decided to build a high-level China-Congo community with a shared future, making it a model for the construction of an enduring China-Africa community with a shared future in the new era.
The Republic of Congo is firmly committed to reinforce solidarity with the People's Republic of China under the framework of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in order to consolidate and develop the relationship between China and Africa.
In Chad, the Chinese foreign minister met with President Mahamat Deby before winding up his trip with a visit to Nigeria, where he held discussions with President Bola Tinubu. In a statement, Wang Yi said he had held in-depth talks with leaders of the four countries on the implementation of the outcomes of the 2024 China-Africa Forum Summit, which was held in Beijing, and reached a broad consensus. He said China was willing to work with Africa on modernization initiatives proposed by President Xi Jinping, among them zero tariffs on specific items, and to improve investment and trade cooperation. On climate change, which is such a hot topic in Africa now, Wang Yi said they had agreed to implement the Partnership Action for Green Development by implementing clean energy projects. In agriculture, such a key part of Africa's economy, the foreign minister said China would focus on food security, poverty alleviation, capacity building, and partner networks. On reforming the global governance system, Wang Yi said China would support Africa in correcting historical injustices, oppose external interference in Africa's internal affairs, and back Africa's concerns on UN Security Council reform. The tour is part of a 35-year-old tradition that sees Chinese foreign ministers visit Africa as their first overseas trip of the year. Following Wang Yi's Africa visit, the groundwork for the FOCAC Beijing Action Plan 2025-2027 has been established. The next phase is its implementation. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Windhoek, Namibia.
To discuss this and much more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen, a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, an Africa security and policy analyst. Gong is a professor at University of International Business and Economics and a China Forum expert. And in Cape Town, Sanusha Naidu is a senior research associate based with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Welcome to all of you. Sanusha, let me begin with you. Wang Yi's Africa tour, as we heard in Robert Nagila's piece, has been a tradition for decades, a tradition for China for decades. What's your takeaway? How is this tour being viewed on the African continent?
Good day to you and good day to my fellow panelists. I think it comes at a very strategic time. in African affairs, in terms of the African continent, particularly in the context of the fact that Africa is moving towards the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But at the same time, the African political architecture and ecosystem has also faced some very important changes. For example, in Southern Africa, we're seeing what's happening in Mozambique with regard to the outcome of the election results. We saw in Botswana the shift in the democratic process and the current political system changing with regard to a new government that has been inaugurated there. And of course, in Namibia, this Gong going through elections as well, but much more stable in terms of the outcome. So I think this visit comes at a time where there are some very important and significant changes that are happening both at the political level, at the governance level, as well as in the context of the economic architecture of the country. And the 4 countries that the Chinese foreign minister has visited actually resemble a lot of these challenges, difficulties, but also the kind of change that is beginning to become imminent in these societies. If you look at Nigeria as well, Nigeria has gone and is undergoing some very important political challenges as well in terms of the social cohesion, the democratic space, and of course the governance architecture. And of course, in terms of its domestic economic conditions, it's not where it wants to be. You look at Chad, with regard to cross-border challenges, looking at where it's located within the Central African region, again, questions of stability and intra-state conflict. Namibia is much more stable, but it goes, of course, very important in the context of where Africa and China play a critical role in terms of infrastructure.
Let me turn to Einar. Einar, Wang visited, just to remind our audience, the 4 countries he visited: Namibia, the Republic of the Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. Why were these particular countries chosen this year? How do they decide? And also, why is the African continent such a big focus, big priority for China?
So China is looking at the future, and right now, FOCAC is going to be headed up by Congo going into to next year. They are looking at countries that are part of Xi Jinping's $50 billion commitment to Africa. So these are countries that all need the kind of infrastructure that the Belt and Road has brought. It's a situation where, especially on electrical generation and transmission, these are absolutely critical. There hasn't been a lot of new projects delineated, but they have certainly started laying the plans for the implementation. And that's very important at a time when there's a great uncertainty about what Donald Trump is going to do. And how he regards Africa. China is a steadfast presence. 35 years of going to Africa first after the new year, after the new term, new year. This shows a commitment that Africa badly needs. And remember, Africa is one of the few continents that is looking upwards. The UN has projected 3.4% growth next year, to go up to 3.7% the following year, and to 4% the following year after that. So things are looking very up.
Abdullahi, let's get to the security question. Wang Yi says Beijing would help train troops and police officers across the continent. How much of a problem are groups like Boko Haram still?
Thank you so much. I think I want to link both the panelist question and answer yours in the sense that the 4 countries that were picked, all of them represent in a very composite way the reality of the African countries. Chad, just this week, the French troops left, and China coming to visit and saying probably to President Diaby that, look, we are here to support you. And if you look at the conflict map across the continent, whether it's in the south, which used to be very stable now with Mozambique, what Sanusha was saying, or in the Sahel belt that is synonymous with conflict, or in the Horn of Africa, as well as in the Central Africa, this is critical. But what China is doing is saying, look, we're not seeing this as a problem, but we are seeing it as a solution, and we are not imposing any solution. Can we collectively try and figure out the solution that fits the African continent? If you look at the number of troops and police that China has on the continent, it is significantly higher compared to any member of the Security Council, permanent members. So in that regard, China knows that this is a problem, but China is not sitting there and saying, this is a problem, let's study and whatever. China is saying, let's find a collective, mutually reinforcing, positive way of solving it.
But on a separate issue, I wanted to know how much of a problem are groups, terror groups like Boko Haram across Africa?
They are a major threat. There's no doubt about it. But the problem is what you had in the Sahel as well as in the Horn of Africa, the preferred modus operandi of the Western countries was to build drone bases like the one in Niger that the United States was building before they were kicked out. Or it is using purely kinetic, that means military force, like the one, French were helping in the Sahel. So the reality is, whereas these are a major problem, that is non-state, violent groups, we hardly ask what are the underlying drivers. And China is saying, we need to invest in the economic future of these communities so that we drain the swamp that these guys find as a source of recruitment, young, educated, unemployed or underemployed youth, by developing the economy for everyone, but not just for the elite.
Understood. And actually, that brings me to my next question. The economies of some of these countries, Nigeria is already one of Africa's biggest economies. What do closer ties with China, this question is for John Gong, what do closer ties with China mean in terms of economic benefits and advancements, John, for Nigeria specifically here?
Well, I think China's economic footprint on the African continent is very extensive. I can't think of one country, maybe the only country that hasn't established diplomatic relationship with China that hasn't developed a very close economic relationship. But practically, pretty much every country on the continent has extensive trade relationships with China, and China's also invested heavily in Africa. I think in general, China does see a peaceful environment on the continent to be conducive to China's activities in Africa, because after all, the relationship between the two sides, the bilateral relationship, is very much based on seeking mutual economic interests. China's probably the only country that has extensive investment and other trade and other economic interests on this continent without actually having a major, in international relations described as force projection or military or defense capabilities in Africa. So I think it's in the country's interest to maintain a peaceful, mutually beneficial relationship with each one of the countries. We have extensive overseas economic interests around the world, and a large portion of it is actually in Africa. So China naturally wants to see a peaceful environment over there. And in general, I think China is agnostic to the political developments in each country. It doesn't interfere or matter with local politics. Left-wing government, right-wing government, as long as it has willing to develop economic relationship with China and protect China's interests in that country, I think the bilateral relationship is on good footing. So I think that's pretty much what China's foreign policy is mostly coming from.
Sanusha, if we could just focus on Chad for a moment. Beijing elevated relations with Chad to a strategic partnership. Talk about the specifics here. What does that mean, again, economically, economic benefits for Chad?
Well, I'm not a Chadian expert, so I won't be able to tell you in greater detail. But I think more generally speaking, we need to debunk some of these narratives that tend to talk about China in a very broad way. I think the countries that the foreign minister has visited have some serious internal dimensions of instability. Chad is one of them. There are internal dynamics there, and those dynamics actually spill over into regional conflicts. And so the idea that this is going to be an economic kind of dynamic that's going to resolve the internal dimensions of conflict in Africa also raises questions for China, because it does pose a security risk for China. And so I think invariably what needs to be looked at in the context of this visit is the four countries very rightly have important dynamics for China from an economic perspective, but from a political security architecture, it raises concerns. And one of the things that I did pick up in the foreign minister's visit was the idea of how to deal with situations where Chinese persons, Chinese economic interests are at risk.
Abdullahi, do you agree with what Sanusha is saying?
Yes, but I also wanted to add a bit that if you look at Chad now, it is next border to Sudan, where we have almost, over 15 million people have been displaced, 3.2 million as refugees, and the rest internally. So Chad stability, because of its next door to Niger as well as to Libya, and on the other side, Sudan, that takes you to the Red Sea. Its stability is important, and French, since its independence, has had a disproportionate interest, including training their military officers, being involved in change of government. Elevating that relationship to a strategic level is in the interest of both countries. But my point is, at the same time, Chad and China can chew gum and walk up the stairs, because you cannot wait until the country's internal economic dynamic is settled for you to come and engage with them. How about you walk on the journey and show them for this to be resolved? Because instability, let's say in Chad, if you add to that belt Niger, Chad, as well as Libya, that is already facing serious internal dynamics, you're having an entire region that might not be stable, which is not in the interest of the countries in those regions, as well as China itself. So I think it's mutually reinforcing, but I take Sanusha's point that to the extent that these dynamics could potentially pose risks, that is something that China, I'm sure, is working on trying to resolve in order to minimize its risks.
Einar, what do you think about what Sanusha and Abdullahi are saying about this? It's not just economics. Security here plays a huge role.
Well, Asya, I agree in general, but I look at it from a slightly different perspective. I mean, China is looking at, just like they look at their own society, at the whole of Africa. And the issue here is that you have a lot of displacement. The colonial past is slowly moving away. We see that in the Sahels. And the issue here is economic development. I'm sorry to say, I mean, extremism comes from this sense of not belonging and not having a future. If I don't care what happens to me because I don't think anything good will happen, yeah, it's very easy to be recruited into some sort of extremist faction. So China is looking at Africa as a series of nations who are interconnected by their borders, but it has to be a situation where they can go forward economically. I mean, China, of all countries, over the last 45 years, has shown consistently that economic development is the key to peaceful development, and that is going to be the theme going forward.
John, speaking of China's efforts in helping these countries develop economically, China's investments under the Belt and Road Initiative have been remarkable. I mean, we've seen the transformation in so many countries. A new expressway in Nairobi, a wind farm in South Africa, roads, bridges, a port in Nigeria, Africa's longest suspension bridge in Mozambique. Talk about how important this collaboration is and what it means. Again, I'm going to focus on the economic side of this, how it's helping these countries economically, and perhaps you can give us the big picture, John Gong.
Yeah, well, I think this is something both African people and we Chinese people are very proud of. I think, for many years, for decades, we all understand that Africa incurs a huge deficit in infrastructure. And just over the last 10 years or so, we have built so many great infrastructure projects, as you mentioned, some of them. And you think about how quickly they are being built and how cost effectively they are being built. Ultimately, these infrastructures do contribute to the local economic development. We have a saying here in China: without infrastructure, an economy cannot develop. Moving forward with these things being built, there's the possibility of having a little bit of a manufacturing, for example, have a little bit of a food processing, for import substitution, and ultimately leading to the goal of industrialization. Africa needs industrialization, and without these built-in infrastructures, all of the things cannot be done. Without electricity, without reliable supply of electricity, for example, and can you talk about manufacturing, right? So I think I think looking back, history is going to say that China did at least do something wonderful on the continent, leaving behind the things that are productive, the things that are vitally important for Africa's economy moving to the next level, which should be focused on manufacturing, focused on more processing and more value added out of the things being dug from the ground in Africa. I think this is in line with China's interests as well. And looking back, there's actually, I can't think of a moment in history that such things are indeed happening for active player from abroad, from thousands of miles away, while at the same time working closely with the local people, such that both sides are happy with this kind of a cooperative relationship, and both sides can benefit from this cooperative relationship.
Sanusha, talk about the role of BRICS. How instrumental is BRICS in developing the global South? Do any of these countries that Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited have aspiration to join BRICS?
Well, I think Nigeria did indicate its aspirations to join BRICS. It indicated its aspirations to become a G20 member. But I think more generally speaking, the countries that have been visited we haven't really seen what their position is. Yes, I think all countries from a theoretical perspective want to join the BRICS because it's about hedging their interests. I think also what's important is that we must recognize in Africa there's a change that's happening in the continent, and this outsider perspective on the continent needs to also be looked at in a much more critical manner. Because yes, indeed, we must understand that within Africa there is a growing sense of wanting to understand what is democratic change and how does democratic change bring about that kind of economic development. And indeed, the challenge for not just China, but many of the external actors within the African context, whether it's China, whether it's countries from the Gulf states, whether it's traditional partners from the developed North, are also facing this kind of critical mass. And I think the challenge for us right now in Africa is to understand that different regions are approaching their different kinds of economic development in terms of what it means. So I think the challenge, not just in the African context, but also for external partners, is to be able to think about what are the structural conditions. Because the big challenge is you can create the infrastructure, you can create the economic development, you can create the opportunities, but it has to come back to the microeconomic architecture of the continent, and each country is different to the other, from the way in which the economic frameworks are framed, from legal texts, etc. So when it comes to the BRICS, I think you've got to also think about the idea that the BRICS is going into its next iteration, but at the same time, the impact of the BRICS is also not necessarily created around the BRICS as a collective. It's still bilateral.
And Abdullahi, I have to ask you this question because it's been discussed so many times, the differences in approach when it comes with how the Western world, United States and EU, handle relations or lack of with the African continent, as opposed to what China has been doing.
That is probably at the heart of this question. Post-colonial, most of the colonial countries in the West, United States did not have a colony on the continent, except its relationship with Liberia. The relationship has been, to an extent, looking at some of these African continents as a problem rather than as an opportunity. especially since the end of Cold War, introduction of multi-party politics, late 80s, early 90s, and then when counterterrorism became the only framework within which Western countries see the continent, you could see the number of military bases that were established across the continent, because this is to deal with something that is more complex than just the need for people to join in some of these groups, and also to prevent some of the young African men and women who are looking for opportunities to go into Europe to not go out. I'll just challenge everybody, if you take the map of the continent, superimpose the number of military bases, whether it's the United States, French, or others, and the number of large-scale headline legacy infrastructure projects that the Chinese are doing, the difference couldn't be any starker. But the reality is, and it was known even then, the just militarization or trying to solve these problems, largely securitizing these problems, did not solve any problem at all. So now we are seeing the French are on their back foot. Americans have been denied some of the places. They might go to other countries, but it is an opportunity to see these as a continent that is on the up, that has got a lot of problems. Let's not kid ourselves. Some of them can be solved by Africans themselves. But if another actor comes in and say, look, I'm agnostic to the kind of politics that is here. Development doesn't know the politics. Development needs everybody having road, hospitals, and people getting their produce from X to Y. I think that is why many of the Africans are attracted to the Chinese model, unlike the finger-wagging accusation and finger-pointing that the West has practiced for nearly 30, 40 years.
Einar, I'm going to give you the final word. Clearly, there are lessons here to be learned from China's engagement in Africa. Donald Trump takes office here in the United States in less than 2 weeks. How do you think his second term is going to change anything, if anything at all, when it comes to engagement and diplomacy with the continent of Africa?
Well, based on his first term, the derogatory terms he used towards Africa, and also the fact that he, in essence, ignored it, I don't think that Africa is looking for a solution, or the countries of Africa are looking for a solution from the U.S. But what the larger picture here, Asya, is that Africa has to do things for itself. And by that, I mean, it is time to start extracting value from what they sell to the rest of the world. And that means that they need to start doing things like OPEC did, taking the strategic minerals and resources that they have and combining with countries outside of Africa to create consortiums where they can control the prices and extract value from them as well, so that they can take care of their environmental issues, take care of their economic development issues. And there's no clearer case than what happened when, in Chad, when they were selling yellow cake to the French for 20 cents euro, wherein the French were turning around and selling it for 200 euros for the same exact amount. So this is a situation, and it's not going to hurt China. China will always be the low-cost provider as long as they stay competitive. But other countries will suffer if they're not able to keep up. But Africa has to take its future in its own hands. It can no longer rely on the false promises of countries who don't really care. And, at COP29, they said 1.3 trillion is needed on a yearly basis to address climate change. What did they promise? 300 billion. It's just not enough.
John Gong, quickly, do you have anything to add before we say goodbye?
Well, I think I want to conclude by saying that this is a tradition for China's foreign minister to take the first foreign visit in a new year, always going to Africa. This has been a tradition for 35 years, and I call it a diplomatic ritual. And this testifies how close the relationship between China and African countries.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being on the program today. And that's where we leave it. I'm Asya Namdar in Washington. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.